Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeff Dalrymple, and you are listening to or tuning in to view the recording of Meet the Experts. This is a great program that we have at ECAP, Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. Why is it great? Because we get to meet some fascinating people who are experts serving Christ-centered organizations around the country and even around the world. Although today, everybody we have here with our live audience are in the great state of Florida, we're recording this little webinar for posterity's sake for the recording. And so I'm Jeff Dalrymple, the executive director at ECAP. ECAP is a national association of Christian ministries dedicated to child and youth protection. We do that through our child safety standards, which are the basis of an accreditation program. It's really the only faith-based, independent, evidence-based accreditation program in the country that works in all 55 U.S. states and territories. And so it's my joy to have a special guest today, Amber Privett. Amber is in the Tampa area. She's one of our affiliate providers doing really, really good work. And so we're thrilled to introduce her to you and to learn who she is and what she does. Of course, today we're talking about supporting survivors. Now, ECAP, while we are primarily focused on prevention, we do want to equip Christian ministries. Those are churches, schools, camps, any child and youth serving organization. We want to equip Christian ministries to respond to reports, allegations, and incidents of abuse. And we want to equip Christians to respond to care for victim survivors of abuse wherever they may be. And so because of that, shared worldview, we are absolutely thrilled to have Amber Privett with us today. Amber, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're at, and what you do.
So my name is Amber Privett. I am a licensed clinical social worker here in the great state of Florida, which means that I am able to independently practice and provide therapy services to individuals living in Florida. I am also a certified clinical trauma professional and a certified child welfare case manager. I come originally from doing case management in the child welfare world before I got my master's degree in social work and went on to get my licensure. So I have years of experience hands-on with survivors of sexual abuse and unfortunately also with victims who didn't make it out of their circumstances. So this is a specific topic that's really near and dear to my heart because it affects the people who I am in the room with, doing therapy with every single day.
Well, Amber, thank you so much for being with us and for taking time to present. So I'm going to turn things over to you, but first I want to invite our live audience to submit questions just simply in the chat. If they think of questions along the way, they can just drop them into the chat. And then the second part of our time together will be me moderating, asking some of those questions as well as some of my own as we learn from Amber. So Amber, I invite you to take it away. I know you've got some slides to share with us.
Perfect. And please bear with me. But everyone, let me know. You can see the screen. Perfect. Wonderful. Okay. So I'm really happy that each and every one of you are here in this audience because it is so important that we are all aware of how we can support survivors of sexual abuse, both in our personal lives, but also practically in our churches and our ministries. We encounter them every single day, whether or not we're aware that that's who they are. So being able to just know how we can best support them is a really great way to help love on people in your area. So first of all, I just want to start with a definition. When we talk about sexual abuse or sexual harm in this presentation, we are speaking about any kind of sexual harm that someone might have endured, whether that is childhood sexual abuse, whether it is a rape or a sexual assault that occurred in someone's older life. We are going over all of it. It also includes intimate partner violence. That is not often considered when we consider the topic of survivors of sexual abuse, but with many cases of domestic violence, rape is a big piece of how people are harmed. For the most part, I will try to use gender neutral language in this presentation, but I do work with mostly women. And so sometimes I transition to using, she, her, but this is relevant for anyone who might have experienced sexual harm. Okay. So there are 4 essential steps to creating a supportive environment for sexual abuse survivors in your church and in your ministry. And this is an order that there is no specific order to them. But the very first way that we want you to be able to create this supportive environment in your church is we want you to be able to recognize that sexual abuse is happening, whether or not it happens in your church or in your specific ministry. You are daily probably going to be interacting with survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harm. So it's important to just know. We'll go over in a little bit some statistics just to give you an understanding of how prominent this issue might be. Okay. Um, we also want you to be able to learn how to make your church a safe space for survivors and ultimately for their loved ones. Because oftentimes, when we are working with survivors of sexual abuse, we are not working only with them. We're working with their parents, we're working with their siblings, we're working with sometimes grandparents and other loved ones in their households. The next step is going to be connecting survivors to help. So, what are some great ways for your church to or ministry to create resources and be knowledgeable about what help survivors can receive? And then don't let survivors become isolated. This is something that we're really going to talk about and how your church and community can support survivors on difficult days throughout the entirety of their life, because this is an issue that might affect them their whole life. Um, So, nope. Number 1, we want you to be able to recognize that it's happening. And when your church, your ministry, and your congregants are able to know that sexual abuse occurs, sometimes, yes, but in your church, but mostly what we find is that sexual harm happens with people that the survivors know, and it's usually happening in their home or in the home of a loved one. So when you know that, when you are aware of that, you are much better able to recognize and respond to the signs of sexual harm occurring to survivors. ECAP does a really incredible job of working with churches to train them on how to identify signs of perpetrators and also how to identify signs that someone might be a victim or a survivor of sexual abuse. I also do training with churches, ministries, and different organizations. But ultimately, what we really want you to know when we think about this is we want you to know that ignoring sexual harm doesn't help anybody. And it's important that we know how to respond when someone tells us that that's going on, whether it's happened to them outside of the church or in the church. And we want you to know that, you know, it happens to adults and children. And because it happens and it's a very pervasive issue, it affects people's spiritual life, it affects their emotional, mental, and physical well-being. And being able to just simply acknowledge the reality of sexual abuse is going to naturally foster a safer and more compassionate environment in your ministry and in your church, where survivors can find healing and where they can find justice instead of feeling like their church was somehow complicit because they were a part of sweeping it under the rug. It also is important to directly address sexual abuse head on because it aligns with the church's mission to care and protect for all members of its community. God has given pastors, ministry leaders, directors, and just Christians in general very specific guidelines and goals and very specific things he wants us to do. And being able to protect our members and our community and love them while additionally helping the vulnerable and the hurting, this is one of the ways we can do it. One of the best ways that you can recognize that it's happening from maybe a ministry director or pastor perspective is talking about it from the pulpit. And we'll get more into the specifics of that in a little bit. But one of the best ways that you can do this, period, is making your church and organizational policies on sexual harm public. Whether that is going over them with new members or volunteers, or whether it is when you do trainings for children's ministries or youth ministries, talking about what you're doing to prevent it from happening in your church and what your church's policy is when you find out that someone in your church this is happening to and they are a survivor of sexual harm. I have seen churches put this information on their website, and I actually think that that's really incredible, that they would be so bold with how they create a safe space in their church for survivors in putting it directly on their website. And if you don't know how to locate that information, or even how do you as a church or a ministry organizationally think through that, ECAP does that. They actually have policies that are available to you and written on their website that are completely for free, but I would highly recommend joining and becoming an ECAP member so that you can just learn more and get access to some of the best information that I have ever seen from an organizational perspective on how to set these policies and where to go. So number 2, when you think about making your church a safe space, you want to think about making your church a safe space for women and for men who experience this in childhood, but also for children and youth. And the most recent statistics typically tend to show that 1 out of every 5 children have been sexually abused. My statistics that I pull from, just so you guys know, come from the Victim of Crimes and Crimes Against Children website, also as well as a couple organizations that are known for doing research in the field of sexual abuse. The interesting statistic to note is that 63% of women specifically who were sexually abused under the age of 14 also had a rape or a rape attempt once they turned 14 and older. So that does play into some of the statistics that we're seeing in the youth section. About 2 out of every 3 sexually abused children were 12 to 17 when it occurred. However, what that also means is that because sexual abuse does happen and take place sometimes at a very young age, it is very likely that that person will be re-victimized. And it will happen multiple times to them, sometimes by the same person and sometimes by a new perpetrator every single time. So churches can specifically look at supporting children who have been sexually abused by 1, training their volunteers in children's ministry how to explain the rules in a really safe way so that children can know they can tell an adult no if they feel unsafe. By using age-appropriate language, you can very, very clearly and easily communicate safety policies to kids. I personally teach at my local church, and every Sunday that I teach, we go over the classroom rules. And one of those rules is when a teacher asks you to do something, do it immediately and cheerfully. However, I always tack on at the very last end of that sentence, but if a teacher tells you to do something that you think is unsafe or is wrong, find another teacher and tell that teacher. And I've never had it happen, but I say that just in case a teacher ever tells a child something that the child is uncomfortable doing. We don't want to force children into obedience just because it's something that we say children should be obedient to their leaders. We want them to be aware that if they feel unsafe, they can say no. Additionally, create a safe and confidential way for children to report abuse to leaders going on. What you're going to see if a child is reporting that they've been abused to you in your church is most typically that they're reporting abuse happening in their home. And so ensure that your children know that they can talk to you about anything that's going on in their home and in their church. But whatever that home life looks like for them, we don't always know. So, a really great thing to do is be able to train your children's ministry volunteers on how to respond when a confidential disclosure does occur. Um, for our youth groups, these are what we tend to think of as our middle school and high school ministries. And a lot of churches that I've interacted with through ECAP and outside of ECAP, when we talk about the topic of sexual abuse and sexual abuse prevention, I will not lie to you, they typically tend to forget the teenagers. And they tend to forget our middle school and high school students that are going to camps and lock-ins and having a lot more interaction that's often much less supervised. I remember being a youth group kid, and I can call it that, but much less supervised than our children's ministry kids. So anything that might happen to them, because pretty much all of them will still be 18 and under, legally, you are still responsible for whatever your local laws are surrounding childcare and child abuse and neglect. And our youth students deserve to be protected just as much as our much younger, more vulnerable children who maybe can't communicate it as clearly when sexual abuse happens to them. And God still calls us to do that because, again, as Christians, He calls us to care for many people, and specifically as pastors, He's calling pastors and youth ministry directors to care for everyone in their congregation. One of the best ways that you can make your church a safe space for youth who are survivors of sexual abuse is to really have good conversations with parents, because parents in your congregation are the primary disciple makers of their children. Your church and your ministry should not be the primary disciple makers for your children. You should be equipping parents on how to disciple their children in the home, right? That's a general principle I think a lot of us on this call would agree with. And so one of the best ways that you can do that is talk to parents on having conversations with their children about sex and boundaries. Encouraging parents to share this with their children, even during as young as the middle school years, though it might be uncomfortable specifically for you to have this conversation, or while it might be uncomfortable for parents to have this conversation with their kids, it is still crucial and necessary. Additionally, you should, make sure that your ministry volunteers are on guard for behaviors that don't feel appropriate for kids' ages, as these could be indicators of sexual abuse. And I would really encourage that your youth ministry leaders not be afraid to have conversations with youth about boundaries that you put in place for things like lock-ins, camps, sleepaway trips, wherever those may be. Two more ways, and I said we would get to this earlier, but that we can think about creating a safe space for survivors in our churches is watching our language. Because ultimately, without us even knowing, our language displays what we value. And as ministry directors who have lots of contact with people, and as pastors and elders of churches who get to say things from a pulpit, which for a lack of a better word is a pedestal that you get put on a little bit, it's really important to know that what we say and how we say it matters. So being really conscious of our language when we talk about sexual harm is crucial for Christian churches and for ministries. It helps foster a culture of compassion and accountability, and it also allows survivors to feel heard and to feel supported, which in turn hopefully helps reduce the stigma and shame that they often associate with their experiences. And in addition, it aligns with some very clear Christian values that we have of love, respect, and justice when we are very careful to try to prevent further harm and misunderstanding for survivors in our community. So by being able to prioritize respectful and precise language, we can better reflect Christ's teaching of dignity and care for all individuals in our congregation. When we talk about language, you can think about specifically when we're giving sermons, messages, and conferences. I've had survivors tell me that from the pulpit, their pastors have made really uncouth jokes about, harming or hitting their spouses as a joke because they had a Band-Aid on their hand. I've had survivors tell me that, pastors talked in really unkind ways about women in the Bible who were sexually harmed, that we have really clear examples of, as well as women out in the community who have been sexually harmed that they were aware of. So we want to be really careful about what language that we're using in these conferences and these messages and in the marketing that you might be sending out as a church. So number one, anytime that you know that your sermon series or whatever topic is coming up in a conference is going to involve scripture that talks about sexual harm or naturally leads to conversations about sex or maybe even marriage, even that one, we need to give survivors a warning in our weekly emails that we're going to be talking about that. So sending a little blurb in your weekly email when you give a preview for next week's sermon that just briefly says, for anyone who might be sensitive to this, this is going to come up in our sermon next week. And it helps those people make a decision about whether or not they come to service. Sometimes we have to acknowledge that that service may not be a safe space for a survivor, and that's okay. So we need to be really clear in giving a warning in advance through email. And I would even argue before you're actually giving your sermon, or you're giving your message or your conference talk, whatever it is. Clearly communicate what content is sensitive and why it's sensitive. And then when you're talking about scripture that goes over things like rape or sexual harm, try to avoid the graphic details about what happened. There most typically is not a reason for you to give that. And so be very conscious of what you're sharing when you discuss this. And additionally, I would encourage you to give context for passages that discuss this. And additionally, then focus on the broader content and the broader meaning behind these passages, because we want to be clear that there's no room for misinterpretation when we are talking about harm. And then after them, I would consider mentioning that your church can provide a list of support services to survivors and their loved ones that are available to them, like very clearly out at the exit door. That way, people who want that can grab it in a safe and confidential way. I also encourage churches to have a safe special prayer time after a message like that, where you're specifically praying for those who have been sexually harmed and you're asking for God's justice and his healing to be present in their lives. And I would encourage churches to consider honoring national days of awareness, the days of prayer, or even a special prayer event. April is actually the month for sexual assault awareness and for child abuse awareness and prevention. And I encourage churches to consider having a special night or prayer time for survivors and their loved ones. Two other areas where we can really be conscious of making our church a safe space is counseling. Whether you or I are fully aware of it, we are in our day-to-day life probably counseling survivors of sexual abuse. And counseling is a biblical word that just means giving wisdom and advice and listening and responding to. It's not actual therapy that you're providing to someone. So if you are a ministry director or a pastor and you get asked to participate in premarital and marital counseling sessions, it is crucial and necessary, though uncomfortable, to talk about sexual harm. One, I encourage you to define consent really, really clearly, and emphasize that whatever is ongoing sexually between spouses is an ongoing mutual agreement. And consent needs to be enthusiastically given and informed and freely given and not coerced from one end to the other. And you can frame this conversation around biblical teachings centered on love, respect, and mutual submission that talk that very clearly talk about this. You can also additionally emphasize scripture that talks about treating one another with love and honor and care. And then encourage couples to have open dialogue and clear discussion about their boundaries in marriage with you as you're providing counseling to them. Even as someone who doesn't do or specialize in premarital or marital counseling, because of the background that I have had friends and loved ones come to me and ask questions about this. And if you're on this call, it's because you are a person that cares about survivors, and I can guarantee you probably will have had questions asked about this to you before as well. And so really think about, how do we clarify, one, consent in the context of marriage, because marriage does not automatically mean that you're consenting to sexual activity. And how do we teach these couples healthy communication skills? And I would say not only teaching them, but also modeling them. It's really important for you in, your marriage to model that healthy communication, and that very respectful behavior towards your spouse. I would also, if you're ever in a context where you are providing premarital or marital counseling, encourage you just to briefly mention the legal and ethical aspects of marital rape, and kind of briefly overview that, because it's a crime that has consequences legally and also relationally. Then in this, I feel like a lot of times what comes up when couples ask questions or have concerns about sex is that one of them typically has been abused. And so it's really hard for people to disclose this information. And when they do, you need to be prepared to respond with compassion, love, and empathy for the survivor. We need to make sure that we're checking our heart and we are not responding to them out of a place of judgment or a place of fear that it might happen to our children or it might happen to anyone else that we know as well. And so I really encourage you, if someone is disclosing this information to you, it's not your job to know that it's factual. You're not a police officer. You're not a child protective investigator. If a child in your ministry is coming up to tell you this, or if a friend is disclosing that this has happened to you, you are there to be a support person and point them in the direction of help that will get them to where they are need to going and get them to a better space. So take very seriously what the victim is telling you, and don't minimize or excuse away what they share with you. And additionally, never ever blame someone for the abuse that they experienced. I encourage, when someone discloses this information to you, whether it's because a hard anniversary is coming up of their abuse or it recently happened and they're sharing it with someone, always immediately offer to pray with them. Pray for their safety, pray for wisdom and discernment in how they handle this. Pray for their abuser to be changed and convicted by the Holy Spirit, and pray that that victim feels loved and supported by the church. And if you're someone who is a ministry leader and you know that, oof, this is not my job to handle the information that I have been given, it is your job to know who you tell that information to, and never promise confidentiality. Always let the person who's disclosing to you know that I might have to, if this is a safety issue, I might have to pass this off to someone else. And realistically, it probably would only be a safety issue if a child is disclosing that it's happening in their home, or if someone is disclosing that it's happening in their relationship, and they're coming to you and talking to you about this. And if you are the support person that those people are going to turn to, make sure that you are guiding them to local resources. And we're going to get to that on the next couple slides. And I would encourage you, even if you're not going to be the support person long term, you can still pray for these people. You can still pray for survivors every single day, mention them by name, or just gently mention them, as a group to the Lord when you're in prayer, and ask God for the things I said earlier, for safety, for wisdom, discernment, for comfort and love, and for them to feel surrounded by the goodness of God in your church and in your community. So connecting survivors to help is so crucial. And there are a lot of ways that survivors can be connected to helping organizations that already exist out there. You do not have to recreate the wheel to create a new department or a new position or a new ministry within your church or your already existing ministry. I encourage you to ask survivors specifically what they need so that you can give them very consistent information. And so that you're not just saying, well, like, go to this hotline or go to this advocacy center. If maybe they're telling you they just want therapy or they just want a support group. There are two really great organizations that I don't have photos or links on of here, but they are wonderful. And they're called the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. They have help and crisis hotlines, chat centers, and online submission forms for help. Additionally, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center has directories of local advocacy centers that are available to you in your community, and you can filter it by states. Additionally, if there is any kind of child abuse or neglect ongoing, make sure that you're always contacting the Department of Children and Families in your local area, so that they can be aware as well. So advocacy centers are really great. They can provide medical services as needed, safety intervention services, and sometimes they even provide therapeutic and psychiatric services. These are all easily available and found online. If you type in sexual abuse victim advocacy center near me, you will find at least one within a several county area of you, because there are actually federal laws that fund these and mandate how closely they need to be to each other in order to provide services to people in all over the United States. They also can help with financial resources sometimes for families if there are concerns for that as well. There are also support groups that are available. These aren't therapeutic support groups necessarily, but they're communities of other survivors of sexual abuse that we should just be aware of, that we can point people to, so that they can find groups of people who've experienced something similar to them. And these support groups are the ones that I recommend. They're led by people who are trained in how to do this, and they're trained in how to handle what might come up in a support group session. And research shows that survivors feel alone and survivors feel isolated. And they don't always disclose to people who they don't know have experienced sexual abuse that this is going on, because they're afraid that they're going to be judged. And so if someone is coming to you and saying, hey, have you ever heard of this? I want to be able to recommend one to a friend. They might be asking for themselves because they're afraid to tell you. So these are on the left side: Door of Hope Ministries, Hope for Recovery, and Journey to Heal Ministries. These are specific organizations that already offer support groups virtually and in person in the states that they're in, but virtually all over the country. And then the Christian Counselors Network from Focus on the Family actually has a filter where you can filter online and in-person support groups. All of the ones on the left and the Christian Counselors Network are Christian organizations. Psychology Today is great and also has support group options, but it is not Christian. So just be cognizant of that whenever you're recommending someone to look there for a support group in their area. Next, therapy. Therapy is very important for survivors when they walk through healing. And there is a lot of research that shows that evidence-based therapy methods are proven to prevent post-traumatic stress disorder from developing. It's proven to reduce the impact of harm on the survivor and reduce any existing anxiety and depression symptoms that they're experiencing. Getting survivors connected to a therapist who can refer them if needed to a psychiatrist for medication management as well, as soon as possible, is one of the best things that you can do and recommend for survivors. Even if they don't necessarily feel ready to fully talk, just creating that safe space in a therapy room for them is great, because they get to have open dialogue with a professional who's trained in how to do this and take care of this. Typically, I tell churches that you should create a list of therapists and be able to offer them to your congregants when asked. Some things to look for on that list are theological alignment with your church and your ministry, specialized trainings in trauma and sexual harm, um, excuse me, a history of working with trauma and sexual harm victims, because not every therapist has worked with them, and you want to make sure that they know how to handle this. And then what therapy methods do they offer that are specialized for trauma and sexual harm? You also want to know what age ranges do they do, and do they have specialized training for working with young children? As someone who is a therapist myself, I am not specialized in training for kids 5 and under, because that is a completely different certification that you get on top of working in the field that you're working in. And so you really want to know, who are you sending your people to? Additionally, you're going to want to know what insurances do they take and how much do they charge for therapy services. And if finances are a barrier, your church or ministry can offer to pay for therapy sessions. You can look at it as paying for a set number of therapy sessions. I will tell you, for trauma and for sexual abuse, they're going to need quite a few. Or you can help people maybe get connected to a local organization that can find funding for therapy for them. I always encourage too, if you know that someone is going in person to therapy and it might be difficult for them to get there, offer a ride, or even make a phone call to see if somebody is accepting new clients on the list that you're giving the person who's been sexually harmed. And number 4, the biggest tip and the most important of all, is don't let survivors become isolated. This happens more often than not with survivors of sexual abuse. And we, as the local church and as ministries that are working with vulnerable people and people who are hurting, we want to make sure that we are giving them solid Christian community, because this, I would argue, is the most important part of healing. Therapy, support groups, other resources are great and they're wonderful and they're awesome, but solid Christian community is one of the best ways for us to love the survivors around us. Scripture gives us a lot of verses and examples of believers caring for one another. And Galatians 6:2, carry one another's burdens in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ, is just one of many, many verses that command us to care for one another. So I encourage you to let survivors participate and encourage participation in small groups. So whatever this rhythm looks like for your local church, it's essential that they get connected to people on a more individual and smaller group basis, because being in fellowship with other believers is just so crucial to their faith development. I encourage, just like I encourage rides to therapy, rides to court dates, rides to doctor's visits, if they have a doctor's visit that's related to their sexual abuse or their sexual harm. And not just when you go to court riding with them, but maybe even sometimes sitting in that room with them, because they need a support person. And they are never going to forget the people who show up for them in court. I can guarantee you that. Additionally, I encourage meal trains. So if you know that a family is going through, their child has been sexually abused by someone and they're just navigating their day-to-day life after that, there are so many great anonymous ways that you can create a meal train for that family. And there are mealtrains.com, bringameal.com, so many different websites that allow you to create a meal train that doesn't say why they need a meal train. It just says they need one. Blast it out to your church or your small group, however you guys normally have that in your ministry, and in your church, and have people sign up so that these families can have one thing taken off of their plate. I would encourage this too, if you know that a court date is coming up, that might be relevant to the survivor's sexual abuse, or even a big hard day that could be an anniversary maybe of their abuser's passing, or the anniversary of a specific memory that was really traumatic for them in their abuse. And before we move on to the Q&A, I just want to leave you guys with one more scripture that really hones in on how we as Christians are called to comfort people in need. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort. He comforts us in all our affliction so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any kind of affliction through the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as the sufferings of Christ overflow to us, so also through Christ, our comfort overflows. And that is in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. And I just think that that's beautiful and wonderful because it reminds us we do not do this on our own. We do this through the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. And we do this because Christ suffered for us and took on our sufferings and burdens. And as a result of that, we get to bear each other's burdens, but ultimately give them to someone who can take care of them far better than we can. And that is Jesus. So,
Can
my
we
contact
leave?
information is here also. If you guys have any more like specific questions, that's my phone number, my email, and the website for my counseling and my training services if you guys are in need of any of those.
Amber, can we leave that slide up there for a few moments here while we take some questions? Yeah, your contact one there. Thank you. Well, this is fantastic. Amber Privett, thank you so much. Be sure to visit Amber's website, amberprivettcounseling.com, there on the slide. We are going to have time for some questions. But Amber, there's so many things that I really appreciate about your presentation. First of all, that you bring your Christian worldview. Like, I can't even imagine being a survivor alone, let alone being a survivor and not having the hope of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so you clearly bring our shared Christian worldview to the conversation, and we so much appreciate and value that. You talked about all sorts of things, including how can a church create a safe place? And by a safe place, what ECAP does is prevent abuse from taking place. And so I know that that is a piece of that safe place, but a safe place may also be just a place where a survivor can be and not be triggered, right? Or re-traumatized. Could you start by talking about language related to, why are you using the survivor language versus victim language? Can you unpack that just a little bit?
Yeah. So when we talk about people who've experienced sexual abuse, there is a difference between a victim and a survivor. The victim is someone who is still actively in that abuse, or someone who maybe did pass away as a result of that abuse, and they never were able to make it through that. A survivor is someone who has, or what, they are no longer experiencing that abuse. They are safe from it, and they're different, and they were able to make it through, because again, not everybody does. And we like to use survivor when talking about this because it is really empowering for people who have experienced it to know that they survived it, they made it through. And very often they made it through by the grace of God, right? And so it's really helpful to have empowering language whenever we talk about people who have been through the worst of the worst, right? Because sexual abuse is something that affects you mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And it really is, the research shows it is not that it's a competition of trauma, but the most traumatizing of abuses.
So unpack a little more about creating that safe environment for us. So, that's a welcoming place where survivors can obviously get help. You've talked a little bit about that. Perhaps the church is ill-equipped or not equipped at all to care for survivors, so they can call someone like you to help them navigate that. But can you give us some examples of maybe some success stories? You don't necessarily need to give church names, but maybe describe for us a church that has done this really, really well. What did that look like?
Man, churches that have done this really, really well. There are multiple, believe it or not. I know we very often see stories in the news about churches that didn't do a good job, but there are really excellent ones out there that do a phenomenal job. I personally know of a local church that found out that there was a child being sexually abused by a parent in the home, and that church actually offered to pay for the children in that home and the non-offending parent to live in a hotel until the perpetrator could be put in jail and go to court, and they were able to safely return to their home again. So that is incredible. And not only did they offer that, but they also helped the family connect to support groups and connect to therapy services for not only the survivor of the sexual abuse, but the entire family. Because obviously, something like that happening is devastating to the entire family, and not just to the survivor themselves. And so they were able to empower the non-offending parent to keep their children safe and to not allow the abuser back into the home, even though it was going to be really scary and really hard. And I'm consistently impressed by that church and how they responded.
Well, it's a great reminder too that you may have a survivor, maybe a minor or a child, and even an adult child, but how that abuse may have wide-ranging impact to family members of the survivor. Maybe even if it's in a ministry context, could even have impact on child or youth workers or others at the church. And so ministry leaders watching this should really take assessment of the impact of that abuse and look for potential other folks needing help, right? Anything more that you'd say on that topic?
Yeah, I would say honestly, I got the idea of doing a prayer night specifically for survivors from a church that does it. I can't pronounce the name because they are in New Zealand. And so I'm gonna really butcher it if I try. But they had a special event in the month of April where they allowed everyone in the community to come and to pray for healing, but additionally to pray for people who were still in abusive situations. And I have, until that church, never seen anything like that. And I was blown away. And I think that's one of the most beautiful ways that you can show survivors that you care very, very vocally and very, very clearly.
So let's contrast a little bit. So you're talking about churches that have done this really well. Well, what about, again, not mentioning any names, but churches, maybe what's a common couple of things that ministries get wrong? And I'm guessing the worst case scenario would be, not addressing abuse, covering up abuse, not reporting abuse, creating a trigger kind of environments. But could you talk a little bit more of like common mistakes that ministry leaders make on this topic?
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest ways that I've seen ministry leaders make mistakes in this area is when they just have conversations about sex in general, specifically in the context of marriage. That's why I kind of hit on that really hard because it is so important for you as a ministry leader and just a Christian who might come into contact with someone who has been sexually abused to be aware that not everybody is comfortable with sexual contact. And so if you are having conversations with people in your church and you're telling them, we'll just get through it, it's your responsibility as the spouse, even though that person hasn't been sexually abused for 15, 20 plus years, and they are technically physically safe, they emotionally do not feel safe. And so it's really important for you to honor that and say, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how hard that must be. What can we do to help you feel better with that? Can we give you a list of therapists who can help you, specifically in this area? I've also, like you said, seen churches dismiss abuse or tell survivors that, well, that happened so long ago. Why is that still affecting you? As well as honestly, one of the biggest mistakes I think ministries make is just not having a plan for how they're going to respond and what they're going to do, one, to prevent abuse, but what they're going to do, two, whenever it does happen and whenever it does occur. Because if you don't plan, you plan to fail.
Well said. Well said. Well, and that fits right into one of 5 of ECAP's child safety standards that we have for child and youth serving organizations, which would include governance, screening, and training of the workers, whatever operations you have in place, and then also to have a response plan. And that's really what you're going for there. We want you to have a response plan at ECAP before there's ever an incident of abuse. And that response plan is going to be specific to your ministry, to your programs, to your identity, to your philosophy of ministry, to your values, but almost certainly should include who to call in the event of an incident or abuse allegation. That could be here in Florida, DCF, Department of Children and Family, or whatever state agency is in your state. It could include your insurance company and maybe some notes of what your insurance policy may cover. Oftentimes, they'll cover legal fees and even sometimes counseling services for certain types of abuse. That may also include in-house counselors or out-of-house counselors like Amber here. Maybe you want to work with Amber to create your response plan or have her on call if you ever need some sort of trauma-informed, clinically informed counselor or therapist to respond whenever there's one of those allegations. So those are some of the aspects that we would want to see you have in a response plan. Of course, that's a requirement for ECAP accreditation. But more on that when you join ECAP and or contact Amber Privett. So, well, this is super helpful. Let's just do a couple more questions here before we land the plane. So very thankful for churches that are doing this well and responding and learning. A lot of this stuff isn't taught in seminary. And so you're bringing a great expertise to this field where pastors are really expected to know a lot of things in addition to preaching and teaching and counseling. Can you talk about mandatory reporter just a little bit? We've kind of danced around it a little bit here, but talk a little bit about mandatory reporter. What is it and what do people need to know about it?
Yes. So mandatory reporter laws do depend on your state. So I would say I am a personal expert in Florida's mandatory reporter laws, but outside of the state of Florida, I am not necessarily an expert. However, mandated or mandatory reporting are the laws and statutes that your state has surrounding being made aware that anyone who is a vulnerable adult, so think an elderly person or someone who's developmentally delayed or developmentally delayed, or a child. So being made aware that anything is happening to them that could be abuse or neglect, and then you need to report that to the state. Here in the state of Florida, every single person who has knowledge or suspicion that there is abuse or neglect ongoing in someone's home is a mandated reporter. And so we can actually be held legally accountable by the state of Florida if they interview you as a part of a child protective investigation and they found out that you knew something was going on and you did not tell. The best way in Florida for you to file a report for abuse and neglect is by calling on the phone. We have a hotline. We also have an online system, but I will say this to their face, it does not work most of the time, so don't use the online reporting system. Some states, you actually still have to file a paper form that you fax over to them in order to file abuse or neglect reports. And in some states, it is not statewide, it is county specific. So be sure that you know the law specifically wherever you are. Some areas do not require that everyone who has suspicion or knowledge report it to someone who can go out and investigate. So be sure that you know too what the difference is in your law versus our law here. I would still say though, ethically and morally, if you have a suspicion or knowledge that child abuse or neglect is ongoing, you should tell someone who can handle it from a professional perspective.
Yeah, that's great. And I think California is one of those states that has county-specific reporting requirements. So whether you're in California or any other state or U.S. territory, be familiar with your mandatory reporter laws. And Amber makes a great point. This would be ECAP's position as well. Even if you're in a situation that doesn't require a report, we still encourage you to report. And so we call that permissive reporting and highly, highly encourage that to take place. Also be familiar with the mandatory reporter laws if you are part of a ministry that maybe crosses state lines. So maybe you're in Florida and you're going to Georgia or South Carolina for summer camp. You're going to want to know what the reporter laws are in the jurisdiction where you may be operating. That goes for regional and national ministries and organizations as well. Amber, this has been great. Let's just talk a little bit here as we land the plane about resources. You've mentioned some great resources, and one of those is a great place to search mandatory reporter laws, and that's RAINN. So you talked about Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, abbreviated for all sorts of reasons, just simply to RAINN, RAINN.org. And so you can go there to find out mandatory reporting laws and statistics and reporting. All that may not count as mandatory reporting, but there is a national hotline there. And tons of great resources. Amber also mentioned National Sexual Violence Resource Center. The link is nsvrc.org. nsvrc.org. That's the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Amber, any other resources besides your website, amberprivettcounseling.com, that would be helpful for our audience of ministry leaders, pastors, counselors, and other Christians who care about this topic?
Yeah, I would say that there are people much smarter than me that have written some really incredible books that focus on caring for survivors, and workbooks specifically for survivors themselves. Those would be Dr. Diane Langberg, Dan Allender, and then Robert Kellerman has a Gospel for Life mini series about it. So I highly recommend checking out all of those. The support groups that I mentioned on the left side of that panel are really phenomenal resources. Like I said, they're available virtually nationally. Some of them have workbooks and resources as well. And again, if anybody has questions or wants me to come in and do a training specifically for their church or be a part of their response plan or their prevention plan, I would love to be a part of that. So definitely reach out for more information.
Amber is a great resource. We've done some events and things together. She absolutely knows her topic and is an expert on this field. So we highly encourage you to connect with her, learn more about her. Honestly, this 1 hour conversation has just been a teaser. We're just scratching the surface on what ministries need to do to be able to respond to all sorts of abuse. And that could be sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, domestic violence, like we talked about. And so be prepared, be equipped, tap into the expertise that Amber provides, contact her for more information and these resources. Amber, could you put that slide back up just as we close here, the one you just referenced with the different resources? And that could be a great resource as folks want to learn more. Well, this has been Meet the Experts, and my name is Jeff Dalrymple with ECAP, Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. Of course, we're a national Christian ministry dedicated to supporting child and youth protection, although we're also exploring the creation of some special needs standards for adult ministries in abuse prevention, because we've learned just some of the horrific statistics of sexual abuse in the special needs population. By that, I'm talking about intellectual and physical disabilities, of course. So learn more about this if your church serves these vulnerable populations, and learn more about ECAP's child safety standards and accreditation program, which provides really our seal of accreditation. And this seal represents trust, the trust that you want to have in your Christian ministry, that provides peace of mind for parents, confidence for leaders, and deterrence for predators. So we're so thankful for Amber and her resources. Be sure to visit ECAP's website, ecap.net. That's ecap.net, where we've got all sorts of free information, resources, and of course, our child safety standards are freely available, both in full text form and in checklist form. So that's part of our public charity. We're here to serve you. So contact us, let us know what we can do to serve you and your ministry. We've got a fantastic team, including our accreditation program director, Jesse Maynor, and all of the folks who've been on our webinar today from the beautiful city of Tampa. And we're just thankful for you and your interest in this topic as we seek to be faithful stewards of what God's entrusted us. Amber, thank you so much for your time today. And we appreciate you making this investment into us and our members. All right, that's it for us. God bless you. Take care.